I see the world in a different way. I don't think there's actually a real geopolitical conflict between China and the United States. I actually see them as symbiotic. And this trade war between China and the United States, it's really a negotiation. It's about leverage because the United States wants more access to the Chinese financial system. It basically wants to create a symbiotic relationship between the renminbi and the US dollar because right now the US dollar is under threat. So basically it wants China to shore up the US dollar. And China is reluctant to do that because the United States right now has $37 trillion in debt. I think that right now for the past 5-10 years, there's been very high level, intense negotiations going on between China and the United States. But eventually, I think that the conflict will be settled and they'll come to an arrangement. I mean, the reality, and it's really important, is that right now, the military that's defending Chinese export, when Chinese ships go overseas, when they go off to South America, when they go to Europe, it's not the Chinese Navy that's protecting these ships. China doesn't have a blue water Navy. It's the US Navy that's protecting these Chinese ships. So we need to understand the underlying fundamental structure of the U.S.-China economic relationship. And then once we understand that, it will be inevitable that they will come to a compromise together.
Will they come under a compromise under a unipolar banner as we have today, or will it be more so a multipolar banner?
The Americans are interested in maintaining the hegemony of the U.S. dollar. China wants to maintain its sovereignty. What China is afraid of is a repeat of the 1997 Asian financial crisis, when Southeast Asian economies, they were tied to the US dollar. So that created tremendous problems in their own financial system. So China needs to maintain its own sovereignty. But China doesn't really think geopolitically. It's not really concerned with who's the boss. China just wants to be left alone. But China's not really interested in competing with the United States for global dominance. I think that for the next 2 years, we're heading into major conflicts around the globe. So the conflict will definitely heat up between NATO and Russia. Ukraine, the military, it's basically been exhausted after many years of fighting the Russians. Apparently, there are rumors that the Ukrainians have lost 1 million men in the fight. So the war of attrition has really taken its toll on Ukraine. But NATO will not give up the fight. We're seeing that Poland has already invoked Article 4, and that allows Poland then to invoke Article 5. Then NATO will come to the defense of Poland. So we're seeing a major ramp up of the war in Ukraine. NATO will start to move forces into Ukraine to shore up Ukrainian defenses. Russia right now will continue its strategy of Russia will continue its war of attrition, which is working really well for itself. At the same time, I think that we will see major escalation in the conflict in the Middle East between Israel and Iran. Israel has declared a full-scale offensive in Gaza City, and eventually I think Israel will strike at Iran. Because as many analysts say, I'm not alone in this, but many geopolitical analysts believe that Israel has a really short time frame to settle the conflict via Iran. It really wants to overturn the regime in Iran, and it sees an opportunity right now. But for this to happen, Israel needs to draw the United States into the conflict. And I think that eventually the United States will come into this conflict on the side of Israel. So we will see two major conflicts in the next year emerge. So this war in Ukraine will escalate. NATO will start sending in forces. We will also see eventually a ground invasion, a U.S. ground invasion of Iran. And this will eventually draw in the entire world because the Middle East, Anatolia, they're really the nexus of global trade. It's impossible to get anywhere in the world without going through the Middle East. Most of the world's oil supply is in the Middle East. East Asia draws most of its oil from the Middle East. So I think that these are the two major conflicts we should be expecting next year or two. At the same time, there's worry about a conflict in the South China Sea. There's a worry that China will take advantage of U.S. overextension. The United States, if it forces a ground invasion of Iran, it'll be overextended, and this will present China with the perfect opportunity to encircle and threaten Taiwan. I think that's very unlikely. I live and work in Beijing, and no one talks about Taiwan. And if you go to Taiwan, no one talks about China. So I think a conflict arising in the South China Sea between China and Taiwan is very unlikely. The wild card in Southeast Asia is actually North Korea. Because North Korea is sending troops to Ukraine. North Korea sees an opportunity to maybe overturn the apple cart, as you like to say. China is very much a status quo power. It benefits from the global trade regime. It does not want to upset the United States. I think that the major surprise is when within the next 6 months to a year, we'll see a major rapprochement between China and the United States. This will benefit both China and the United States. China needs access to the American market. The United States needs cheap Chinese labor. It basically needs to stabilize the situation in Southeast Asia. In fact, there's rumors that the Pentagon is about to release a new paper, National Defense Priorities, that makes this argument, that argues that right now we're too overextended and we need to focus more our resources internally and sort of come to peace with China. So this is how I see the world developing next year or two. In the Middle East, in terms of military might, Israel does not have a peer adversary. If the United States were not in the Middle East, Israel could just go and attack every country. It's really the United States that's really restraining Israel. I'm not sure if you've been to Israel, but I've been to Israel, and it's a very impressive country. It's not a very big country, but the sort of like the innovation that goes on there, the sort of risk-taking, the sort of continuous debate that goes in the country. I mean, it's very impressive. Netanyahu has basically said that from now on, Israel is going to move towards a Spartan society. It's going to become a warrior society. It's unfortunate because before, Israel was this very open, democratic, cosmopolitan nation. But because of what's going to happen in the next couple of years, I think that Israel will become a fortress, and a military fortress at that. So whatever civil liberties, whatever openness, whatever cosmopolitanism that Israel had before will evaporate over time. But at the same time, the sort of innovation and openness that goes on in Israel is not really matched by any other nation around it, especially not Turkey. Erdogan is a very savvy political calculator. He strategically, politically, he's very, very clever. And the way he's clever is that he balances different forces against each other. But I think that he's smart enough to know to never come to full confrontation with Israel. In fact, it's Turkey that supplies Israel with a lot of resources, especially oil. The talk is great. And I think that Erdogan is trying to play both sides. But at the end of the day, you have to watch what he does. There's no way that Turkey is going to come into another conflict with Israel, and Turkey will continue to support Israel. You look at what happened in Syria. ISIS would not have overtaken Syria without the full support of Turkey. Erdogan is playing all sides, and he's really interested in his own political survival. At the same time, because Turkey is doing that, Turkey is extremely vulnerable. Turkey doesn't have the sort of innovation, the sort of military prowess that Israel has. So if there's a conflict, then we can see that Turkey would basically break down very, very quickly. So I think for the past few years, Iran has shown tremendous diplomatic, strategic, military restraint. And the reason why is it understands that its maneuverability is very limited. I mean, it cannot provoke the United States. I mean, it provokes the United States, it loses global opinion. And the United States, I mean, at the end of the day, the United States has nuclear weapons, Iran doesn't. The United States will always have escalation dominance. So that's why we're seeing such a tepid, such a restrained approach by the Iranians. So I don't think that the Iranians will attack the Gulf states. I mean, it loses popular opinion. It loses global opinion if it were to do that. And right now, global opinion is very much on the side of the Iranians. It's the Iranians that have shown tremendous restraint during these past few months. And I think the world appreciates the Iranians for doing that. And also from a military perspective, there's no way that Iran could ever defeat either Israel or the United States in a head-to-head conflict. What Iran needs to do is force a ground invasion. It needs the Americans to come into Fortress Iran. And once the Americans are in Fortress Iran, they're stuck there because I'm not sure if you've seen the terrain of Iran, but it's mountainous and it's terrible for logistics. And America doesn't really have the supply chains, doesn't really have the manpower to fight a long-term war in Iran. That's the only way that Iran can ever defeat the United States at the end of the day, if it provokes a ground invasion and if the American forces are trapped in Iran.
Where does China fit into all of this? Because China has a lot riding on Iran as well. Will they contribute anything? Will they have some role to play in the war between Iran and Israel?
I think a lot of people are saying that China cannot afford for Iran to lose. China imports a lot of oil from Iran. China is trying to build trade corridor between it and Iran because once it has Iran, it's able to access Europe, every place basically. But again, China doesn't really have a geopolitical framework. It doesn't really have a geopolitical strategy. It wants everyone to trade peacefully, but it doesn't really have, it's not willing to commit the military forces. It's not really to be aggressive in trying to achieve its framework. It doesn't really have the intelligence apparatus. It doesn't have the bureaucratic framework. It doesn't really have military capacity to dominate outside its territory. So I think that throughout this conflict, China will remain the peacekeeper. It will try to bring the opposing parties to the negotiating table and try to achieve a peaceful settlement as soon as possible. But China will never, ever commit military forces in the conflict. The theory is the Odessa trap. And the idea is that maybe for the next year or two, you'll see a lot of flare-ups throughout Europe. But eventually, all this conflict will converge in Odessa. What will happen is that Russia will encircle Odessa, and NATO needs to defend Odessa, because once Putin takes Odessa, the war is over, because Odessa is the last military strategic objective of Russia. Once Russia has Odessa, then it controls the coastline, it controls eastern Ukraine, which is the agricultural industrial heartland of Ukraine. Western Ukraine would just be a rump state. The Europeans would need to basically put everyone in Western Ukraine on welfare. So Odessa really is the strategic hub of Ukraine. And so Russia will encircle Odessa, and Europeans will be forced to support Odessa. But once the Europeans start to introduce the draft, it's going to cause massive discontent throughout the continent. A lot of these regimes, you look at what's happening in Britain, you look at what's happening in Germany, in France. You've been just following the news about what's happening in Germany, like these 7 AfD candidates who've been mysteriously died for different reasons. So there's lots of things going on throughout Europe. So I think these regimes are much more fragile than they appear to be. And I think like these elites don't have the mandate to call up a draft. And if they do call up a draft, it's going to cause a cascade of internal rebellion, civil war, civil strife, conflicts, even revolutions. One thing that's really important for your viewers to understand is the eschatological element to what's happening in the Middle East. We often use a geopolitical or economic framework to interpret events in the Middle East. But one thing that we don't do enough is talk about the religious elements. There are crazy religious elements at work in the Middle East. You have Netanyahu is supported by the extreme religious right, and they want to bring about the end times. They want to bring about the end of the world. And I think that's why you're seeing so much tragedy in Gaza. And that's why I think that Israel is going to attack Iran. They're trying to bring about biblical prophecy. And that's what drives these people. If that's the case, then this thing can only culminate in tragedy. I think it's really important for us to appreciate the eschatological element of what's happening in the Middle East. Otherwise, it's going to be very confusing for people what's going to happen. I'm not sure if you looked at the red heifer case where the Israelis have imported red heifers. Why would you do that? Well, according to a prophecy, you need red heifers to be sacrificed in order to sanctify the third temple. But to build a third temple, you would need to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So if that were to happen, you can see the entire Muslim world, all 1 billion Muslims around the world, they will be up in arms. And I think when that happens, everyone's going to be like completely shocked. But unless you understand the religious eschatological elements to this conflict, then nothing makes sense.